really enjoy it and you want to share it with somebody else, there's a way to do that. But for now, 10 years, here we go. Woo. All right, moderators, let's get our first questions here.
What do you think the biggest differences between middle grade and young adult books in terms of themes, tone, or the ways characters are portrayed?
All right, so who wants to kick off? The big difference between
Someone who writes both
YA.
middle grade and YA.
Hi, that's a great question. I am somebody who writes both. It's kind of a happy accident that I fell into middle grade. I made a joke online with an editor about Miami, growing up in Miami, being goth kids and how hard it is to wear black in a tropical climate, and it just sort of rolled on from there. We call it Tropigoth, if anybody wants to run with that. I think the biggest difference, and I was really intimidated to write middle grade, because sometimes people think if you're writing for a younger audience, it's easier, but it's not, because you guys, it's really hard to make middle schoolers laugh. So I think it comes down to voice, and I think also with middle grade, there's always a thread of hope. And so you're searching, it's more about friendships and families, while in YA, you're sort of looking outwards from that and trying to figure out who you are in the world beyond the people you come from. So.
Yeah, I'm going to second that. Originally, I wrote for young adult before deciding that I wanted to make my story middle grade, and I feel like there's also this whimsical playfulness to middle grade that isn't necessarily there in young adult, because when you're in young adult fiction, I feel like it's more grounded in realism and reality. And with middle grade, there's just this charm to everything. And so not only do we as authors sometimes feel that it's not as easy because we want to make you laugh, we also just know that you guys are also just looking for an adventure, you know? You guys are always out trying to explore the world. And so it's not just about like friendships and family versus trying to find a place of belonging. It's also just, who am I in this world versus how can I make a difference in it? And so I feel like that is another great difference between YA and middle grade that a lot of people get to see as they grow up and as they grow into these stories. And once you know where that place is in the world, you know, it can be so magical to look back at the times of reading middle grade in YA and just say, wow, okay, I love what these remind me about my inner child.
I'm also somebody who kind of fell into middle grade because the rest of my publications are science fiction and fantasy for adult readers. And I wrote a lot of young adult manuscripts, which I haven't yet sold one. And then just kind of, I was drawing, I think, on my background in Miami, and I spent my youth in Miami, so it was natural to write a younger protagonist and just try to focus on some of those fun things, and then that's the thing that sold. And so one thing, definitely that sense of family and the family still around. I feel like a lot of times with the older protagonists, you've got to get the family out of the way so that the teenagers can go out and protag and do their thing. And with Benny, my book, Benny Ramirez and the Nearly Departed, I enjoyed really writing a very warm family where everybody in that book really loves each other, even when they have their conflicts. There's also, I think this is lightened a little bit, but when I started trying to break into the field, there was a very strong pressure that a young adult book needs to have a romance plot in it. And that's not a particular strength of mine, and so that's one thing that's made it hard to sell in that space. And that's not really an expectation in middle grade.
I was the author of Wish I Was a Baller, and so it's getting published as a graphic novel, but its initial version was a YA novel. It was a YA memoir that I wrote even before it got sort of adapted into this graphic novel format. And in the YA version of it, obviously it was, you know, the themes were a little bit more, I would say, American Pie in terms of its tone, but then I had to adapt it for Scholastic's audience, which obviously is a lot younger, and so the challenge was, how do you take something that happened in high school but write it for a middle grade audience? And I think what we did is, you know, we took a lot of things that, you know, skewed a little bit older, and it wasn't that we tried to like marginalize them and just kind of cater them to like a middle school crowd, but in essence, it kind of freed me up to really tell what was important that universally someone who's in high school or middle school can go through these experiences and see what I went through, and it doesn't matter what the age was. And so that was a really interesting challenge.
Can we hear from some of our YA authors on this?
You want to go? Okay. I mean, I wish I had more to add. I've always been intimidated by middle grade, and that is because it is harder to capture. And I keep thinking of like the Studio Ghibli films that has that middle grade feel, and it is back to the whimsy. There's like a magical quality where you're just exploring who you are. It's more internal. YA is really where is your place in the world, and so it's different themes. But I think both of them have a very strong sense of hope, and and seeing how you grow up, and hopefully there's more alive parents in YA now. But yeah, that is a common trope, to just like the orphans, and I'm guilty of that myself. It's because you want to see how your character survives in the world on their own, and that's usually what happens in YA. You're discovering how you interact with the world.
Go, you were next.
Oh, thank you. So I don't write middle grade, and there's a reason I don't write middle grade. I don't have what they call a middle grade voice. I spent a long time working with high school students and college students, and I love high school students and college students. Those are the voices that I hear in my head, so that's why I write for that age group. But I know that YA also has that kernel of hope, what we call the kernel of hope at the end of the story. My stories are really dark stories. They're dark, twisty mysteries with a little bit of magic or paranormal, but they're about pretty heavy topics. There's a lot of grief and a lot of anxiety and all sorts of things going on, but they always have that kernel of hope at the end. That's really the difference between YA and middle grade and adult. Adult stories don't necessarily have to have that kernel of hope at the end. As far as the difference between middle grade and YA, I've read a lot of middle grade, and I've read enough middle grade to know that I think Nina was the first one that said it, but it's spot on right, that middle grade is really focused on finding your place in your family and your friend circle. YA is about finding your place in the larger world. Who am I and what am I going to be? What's my responsibility to these people that live in the world with me? Where do I find my place? How do I fit in? All of those things we call coming of age stories. That's really what you find in YA.
Yeah, and to build off of that, I think too, when you're talking about middle grade, sometimes family can play a part in helping to solve a problem or helping support you through a problem in a way that isn't necessarily the same in YA. In YA, I feel like sometimes you're dealing with moral situations that are a little more complex. So maybe the right answer isn't always so obvious, and sometimes you may disagree with the adults in your life about what the next right path is for you. So sometimes it's really finding your own footing in the world apart from your parents, and sometimes you may disagree, and you can do that respectfully, but you can have a difference of opinion because you're growing into your own person. Whereas I think in middle grade, you're much more, with your parents, you're more aligned sometimes. And then as you get older, sometimes that changes. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing, it just happens, and sometimes those moral quandaries you go through can be very gray, where the answer that you're looking for is dependent on the person and their experiences more so than like a right or wrong specific thing. You're dealing with a more complex problem where there's a couple of ways to solve it, and you have to figure out which one works best for you. All right. Are you doing the next question, or do we have somebody else? Okay.
Do you think there's room for books between middle grade and young adult, especially for readers who feel too old for one but not quite ready for the other?
Okay, I'm going to answer this because that's where I feel like my books fall. So I feel like there are definitely some books, especially in series, where they can start as one, but as the readers grow, it can help bridge that gap between the middle grade and young adult genres. So in the case of my series, the books start out with smaller problems that the family helps with. And then as the characters become more confident in themselves and grow up, they have to face bigger problems. And I just felt like it was a natural progression for my readers to see in my work. And so I definitely think like there's a place for that. And I would like to see more for that space, because I feel like sometimes we have the tween readers that are between middle grade and young adult, and they don't feel ready for young adult. But they also feel like middle grade is too young for them. And so I love seeing stories that are not afraid to push that boundary just a little bit and say, hey, we understand, we've got you. As this series grows and you grow, we'll tackle this together. We'll do this together. And so I definitely feel like there's a place for it.
I second what you're saying, because I don't think there's enough books for example, upper middle grade or lower YA. But that's ages between, like, say 13 is just like that perfect sweet spot where there's just not enough fiction. And it was always pushed back that publishers weren't looking for this demographic or it wouldn't sell. But you can see now that they're, like, the question that there is an audience that's starving for that protagonist that's in 8th grade on the cusp of high school. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to publishing, unfortunately, because there is absolutely room for crossover stories, right? But the problem is a lot of times middle grade, it tends to be skew older, younger, and then YA, they're always 18 and they're always seniors. But it's supposed to be 13 to 18. So where does that 13-year-old find themselves? You know, they don't want to read in middle grade a lot of times. They want to, you know, so a lot of times it comes down to publishing and shelf space. They're looking for the same sort of age over and over and over again. So sometimes these kids sort of fall in these bubbles, unfortunately, where they can't see themselves.
I think that it is maybe getting a little bit better on an industry level. The first novel of mine that got an offer of representation from an agent and that we shopped around featured a 14-year-old protagonist. And the 14-year-old protagonist was the kiss of death. You could not sell a book with a 14-year-old protagonist because it was too old for middle grade, it was too young for young adult. And you know, that book withered on the vine and we weren't able to sell it. But the thing is, I always feel like my voice actually is maybe a little bit more on that YA side. My sense of humor tends to be a little bit more snarky than some of the middle grade stuff that I read. And what I'm reading now from middle grade, I feel like there's more of a home for older middle grade, for upper middle grade, and yeah, a little bit of younger young adult as well. Like that sense that young adult must always feature a romantic plot line, I feel like is lessened than it used to be. So I feel like the industry's making a little bit more space for that.
That's very hopeful. Do we have another question from you, or are we transitioning?
How do you deal with writer's block?
Okay. As someone who is a self-pubbed author, self-published for those of you who do not know, this is something that I come across so much. It is ridiculous because I have to not only write for myself, I have to market for myself, and I have to do all of the edits, all of everything for me. So it sometimes leaves me feeling very drained. Number one, I listen to music. Always find a place to listen to music. I will make music based on my characters. I will do playlists based on different cities, different world building tactics, different books. So music is my happy place. Another thing that I really like to do is grab my accountability friend. I have a writer buddy of mine that I constantly am just like, hey, I am in a rut. Do you want to write with me? And she says, I mean, maybe, but how do you know it's going to get us out of writer's block? And I said, well, hopefully we'll be angry and complain at each other that we don't have any words until one of us actually gets any words. And then she says, and if you actually do it, I'll draw you something, because she's also an artist. So I said, okay, now we're talking. I can do it. So always find yourself a good friend. Chat with them, vent about your story with them, brainstorm with them, you know. That helps me get out of writer's block all the time. Just having somebody to talk to about my writing process, because sometimes that block just happens because we're keeping it all bottled up and we have nowhere to release it. And we can't release it on the page because we don't know what we're wanting to do on the page. So good music, good writing buddies, taking a break, breathe a little bit, come back to it. That's some of my best methods for writer's block. I don't know about the rest of you.
Mine is simple. Go for a walk.
That's a good one.
Just go for a walk.
Or a shower.
Yeah. You need these areas where you're not thinking about that particular thing that you're thinking about. And that's where, I kind of talk about like the power of the subconscious working for you. It's that great little machine that you just have to let it do its job. And it's not going to do its job by itself. You're going to have to push for it. But I do think that allowing yourself to have that room to, I use that word marinate, to let things marinate.
Were you the one that asked me this question in the musical theater class?
No, someone else did.
Someone else did. Okay, I knew you were there, and somebody asked me that question. I have a really unusual answer for that. I don't believe in writer's block. I don't think it exists. What writer's block is when I am stuck is that what it means is usually that there's some problem I have not figured out. And that what I need to do is figure out what problem is stopping me from writing. What do I not know about my story? What plot point is not working? Or what character arc is not working? There's something in the story that is not right, and that has stopped me in my tracks. But this idea of I'm blocked, I can't write because my creative juices will not flow, I don't think that's a thing. If it was, books would never get written because we write on deadline, and we have to write whether we are inspired or not most of the time. So for me, what people call writer's block is usually some problem that I have not untangled in the story yet.
I believe in writer's block. But I think writer's block can be a lot of different things. Writer's block, sometimes I experience writer's block and then I realize after wrestling with a scene, maybe for multiple writing sessions, and then I realize, it's because I have decided that the protagonist is going to do X in my infinite wisdom, but I cannot write the scene because this character would not do this thing, and I cannot make it work, and I can't find the words to do that. And so when that happens, that writer's block is a gift because it's prevented me from powering through and writing a scene that was never going to work anyways. So that's one reason it could happen. I think if you are struggling with something on an emotional level and you're just in an unhappy place, it can be very difficult to find your creativity. Sometimes your creativity can be how you work through things, and it can be, freeing and taking you to a better place. But sometimes it just saps your energy, and so it might be that you have to get some help and try to figure out ways to work through whatever else you're struggling through. But sometimes it can be hard when life is hurting to find that energy. And then another thing that I struggle with is I struggle with kind of like an executive dysfunction, sometimes a difficulty to begin to do the thing. And deadlines helped me a lot because, we've already sold this book, so I've already got to get this thing done. But the process of working on these couple of books on very, very tight deadlines, I think kind of broke something in a positive way, like broke a barrier in me. And now I'm like, I can't articulate how I can break through that executive dysfunction, but I know that I can because I've had to do it. And now it's easier for me. So a lot of practice and a lot of years struggling with the things that are challenging for you because that's normal until you get more comfortable and better at it.
Yeah, I love the idea that it's a gift. For me, it's like an alarm. When I'm annoyed with myself because I know something isn't working, I haven't put my finger on it, but I know something in the story is not working and I need to go back and fix it, and I'm just being lazy about it and I don't want to go. So I'm preventing myself from moving forward. That tends to be what happens. So then I have to go back through my outline, back through what I've written, and see where the snag is on the thread. Another thing I do, when I'm overwhelmed, feeling burnt out, I love to rewatch the media that first inspired me. So I'll go back to comfort shows, comfort movies, and I'll consume those things until I feel myself nice and full and satiated and ready to continue.
And this sounds really lazy, but take a nap. I take a nap sometimes when I'm having writer's block, and honestly, it's because I'll start thinking about what it is that I'm struggling with, and then I'll close my eyes, and I'm not necessarily going to sleep. I'm just resting my eyes and letting my subconscious sort of free itself. And sometimes when I do that, the idea will come to me. But I know for me, many times, most of the time, when I say I have writer's block, I have perfectionism block. And it's just because I'm scared to put it on the paper, because the first time I put any kind of story on paper, it sounds terrible to me. Horrific. I put it on the paper, and to my writer ear, when I'm listening to what I'm writing in my own head, it's not musical yet. And it's because I can't make it perfect. I have to put it down first. And that's so imperfect, and it's very, it's a time when you're insecure. At least for me as a writer, I'm very insecure at that stage. So I have to work through the perfectionism, and that for me is the writer's block. It's sometimes a problem, but most of the time it's fear on my part that I'm somehow gonna fail this story badly because I'm just not good enough to write it. And so I have to just get words down. So I always tell myself, the words are all you gotta do. Just put the words down. You're playing in the sandbox right now. Just shovel it in the bucket, get it in there, and then you can make the castle later. Right now, you're just shoveling the words in.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you share what your typical day as a writer looks like? Do you stick to a strict schedule or write whenever inspiration strikes?
I don't have a strict schedule, and I don't have a strict schedule on purpose, because the reason I chose writing, because my first career is as a director and an acting teacher. I've worked in the theater my whole life, and we have really weird, flexible, odd schedules, and I didn't want a schedule, so I didn't want to take my nice job that didn't have a schedule and give it a schedule. That seemed really counterintuitive to me. The whole reason I picked writing was so I could work it around all the stuff that I want to do. So I don't have a daily schedule. Depends on my deadline. If I'm really close to a deadline, I might write 10, 12 hours a day and edit. If I'm really far from deadline, I might not write at all. I'm not one of those people that believes you have to write every day. I don't write every day. I've got 4 published books. I write every day when I'm close to my deadline, but when I'm not on deadline, I'm much more relaxed about it.
I'm going to say hallelujah to that because I've always experimented with time blocking and sort of like these routines. Nothing ever really works consistently. I think, and everyone's lives are so different and everybody's responsibilities are so different. For me, I always like to pick the pockets of what really work for me. Sometimes I'll be in the car line picking up my kids and I get that 15, 20 minutes where I'm just sitting there, and that's where all, the thoughts, go into my notes app, and then I'll just save it for later, so I think it's about finding that happy area where and then again, nothing will burn a fire like a deadline. I went, the 3rd book in my series, I wrote the first 15,000 words, 3 months, slow. I had a 3-week deadline. 15,000 words came 3 weeks really fast.
I'm somebody who, when I first started writing my book, my first child was a baby, so I wrote at night a lot. Then they get older, and I'm trying to write during normal school hours, and I just can't. It's a struggle. I am a night owl, so I try to do my sort of administrative work as a writer, all the emails and everything during the day, and then I try to write. If I'm not on deadline, then it's a 10-hour day, and it's terrible.
So I am also not one of those write every day folks. I have a day job. I am a high school teacher, and I've got my teaching and my lesson planning and my grading to do, and then sometimes I'm just tired. So I think when people get all like, well, you must write every day, it almost makes it sound like a discipline. And okay, yes, it takes discipline, and yes, it's a job, but it's also an art, and it's also something that we do because we love it. So I don't need to discipline myself to make myself come back to the laptop at some point and do some writing. So, I'll take many days off, or I'll take some weeks off and fill my cup and consume art. And then I get excited about something, and I get eager, and I get wanting to do it. And I come back to it because it's a thing that I love. And then when the deadline comes, then I am putting in those 12-hour days. And I've gotten to the point now where it's a little bit addictive, the adrenaline. We're in that mode again. Okay, the first time that was no fun at all, but now. That's
why I put on my mama mentality.
Now, as a self-published writer, I don't have my own deadlines. And I like to take every day as not necessarily time to write, but time to find inspiration. And if that causes me to write, then awesome. But if I get inspired of something and I at least know something a little bit more about my character, or know something a little bit more about my world, I will take that as an absolute win. And I feel like it's so important for us as writers, and this goes for hobby writers as well, to not overwork yourselves and to not dig yourself into a hole mentally. Because like we were saying with writer's block, it tends to happen because we push ourselves, or because we're worried about being perfect, or can I do this right? Can I do this on the page right? And so I feel like when it comes to a routine, we don't set these kinds of blocks because these blocks of time could lead to more burnouts. And so it's much easier for inspiration to flow if we let it flow. And so that can go for busy students as well. Any busy student can become a writer as long as you have the ideas and you let those words flow. And of course, you know, if you have an essay and it's like a creative writing essay and it's due, that will give you some fire underneath your sail to get everything done. But at the same time, you also know, hey, this is not the final version of the story. I am just getting it down. And I am going to be getting it down by this deadline, but that does not mean that my schedule has to stay like this.
I think I'm like the only one up here who's super regimented, listening to everybody, but I have to be, and it's because my job is actually creative. So I write for a living too. So I write scripts for educational videos during the day. So the problem is that that is also creative. And so I really have to get up in the morning and do my own work first, because to me, that's my first priority, is my story personally. So I have to get up really early and do that creative writing first while my brain is fresh. Because once I get to my regular job and I'm having to be creative all day, by the end of that day, my well is completely empty. So if I don't give my time to me before I start the job, that time won't happen. And I have to make sure that the freshest time I have, I give to like my art first. And then I give it to my job second. But by 2 in the afternoon, I'm like really, really done. I have no more creativity left to give anyone. It's bad. My kids are like, you can't even talk straight some days. I'm like, I can't. It's really bad.
You know, there is no really some magical process of writing. You got to do the work. You really do. And it doesn't matter if it's 100 words a day or 1,000 words. You're going to have those days where you're on and then you're off. And those are going to be some days where you do the most thinking. And the next day, oh, I can put it all down. I think you have to understand who you are and what works for you. But you definitely, Hemingway has a really great thing where he would leave the next sentence, he would have the next sentence for the next day left over so he can work on that, and he knows exactly where he's starting from. So, I mean, you can find a writer and figure out what their routine is, but honestly, doing the work, it's kind of hard, but there's nothing really glamorous about it.
Yeah, do the work, and even if you can't get like more than a sentence, at least find inspiration in what you have written and try to think about it, because no story is without its ideas, and no story is without its characters. So start from that starting point, even if it's just one little starting point, and then just keep going.
It's worth pointing out that different parts of the writing process require different parts of your brain. Because, I can't generate interesting ideas after a full work day, but I can draft, actually. I can keep on drafting. So if I'm trying to ferment something new, that's more likely to happen on the weekend or on a vacation than after a work day.
I like giving myself like small tasks. So instead of saying, I don't know, I have to write today, I'll just be like, I just have to do one sprint. Do one 20-minute sprint where you get as many words as you can on the page. And it seems so small that I end up getting a lot of words in during that time. And it works for me.
Yeah, sprints are great. I highly recommend it for essays as well.
Yeah.
If you guys have an essay that's due and you just want to get words down, I highly recommend it.
There's a thing called the Pomodoro technique, I think. I might be where you just would do something for like 25 minutes straight, then take 5 minutes rest. 25 minutes, 5. 30, 10. Just, you can do it, that's like time blocking, and essentially that's a tactical way of going about it.
This applies to academics. All right, next question.
Have you ever had to rewrite a story or change something big in your book after getting feedback, and how do you handle constructive criticism?
I am currently dealing with that. And the person who did critique was my friend, aforementioned, that I said I do sprints with. So I let her look over what I did, and she said, Catherine, the mystery ain't mysterying. Because the current story I'm writing has a mystery in it. And she said, I don't feel it. I don't see why this character has this mystery. Why do they have to be the one to solve it? And I realized that I had skipped the most crucial step of my drafting process, which is figuring out why it matters for the character. So I am currently in the process of rewriting that entire book, which is no fun, but I feel like it was really needed and really necessary for me to hear, because I would tell her if something was off and I wasn't feeling connected to her story. And so for her to tell that to me, it's important to know the difference between constructive criticism and somebody just flat out, hating your stuff and giving you feedback. And your book won't be for everybody. That's a very true statement. No book is going to have a 100% approval rating. You might have 99%. Somebody's out there. That one troll on Goodreads. Yes.
A specific example of that I dealt with was my debut novel. It was my first novel. It has hints of magical realism, right? So I was throwing in all this sort of whimsical stuff. And I had this one where Rosa, my main character, who she's been told her whole life she's been cursed by the sea. She wants to see Cuba. She wants to see where her family's from. And so I had a moment where she was in a bookstore and she found a library book, and it was her grandfather from Cuba's library book from the University of Havana, and it was this whole thing. And my editor was like, "This is beautiful, but it doesn't fit in the story. You have to take the book out." And I was like, "I love the book." Because sometimes with your first book, you're so excited that you're publishing that you want to put everything in it, but then you realize some story elements are for other books, and that's okay.
Yeah, I don't handle criticism very well, especially with that first email. When you submit your book, you get an editorial letter, right, from your editor, and it's going to be like this long letter of all the changes and suggestions, and it'll start off with some really nice things to say, and then they'll get right to the meat of it, which will be, here's what you need to shift. And I remember the first book that I turned in, I had to change the entire first half of the book, and you have to take a couple days. You have to take a couple days, and then you go back to it. So I think it's about how you can compartmentalize criticism and realize that your editors are not there to take things or to hurt you, but to make the book what it should be. And you got to essentially trust the process, as hard as it is, because there is a certain degree of perfectionism of what you talked about, of when you submit something that you have to be like, you know what, they know better than I do, but I got to take some time for myself.
It's almost like the stages of grief for me, right? Like at first I'm like, how dare they? I was perfect. But then, then it's acceptance, and then you reread it and you're like, okay, well, they were right. I have to fix this, especially if you get the comment repeatedly. You just have to kind of switch your brain from a writer brain to an editor brain. Yeah. And then look at it from a more critical eye and be like, oh yeah, this sucks. I need to fix it. So it's really just like changing your, the thinking cap you have on.
It was, the best way to harden yourself against criticism of your writing, I think, is to come to writing from the theater, because we are really used to criticism in the theater. We are really used to rejection. We're used to walking in, doing our best, acting our heart out, and not getting the role. Coming from that world, I think I was a little bit more used to that kind of rejection and that kind of criticism, and it just kind of rolls off me. I'm like, yeah, well, that one didn't like me. Maybe the next director, maybe the next editor. But for me, the other thing that's really important, I've had the same editor for all 4 of my books at Penguin now, and I know her really well, and I trust her really well. I've never had to rewrite anything major in any of my stories, but there are always little edits and little revisions. And for me, it's just knowing that she's right almost all the time. And she has that distance sometimes that I don't have. Sometimes it does take me a day or two to step back and go, oh man, she's right. I hate that she's right, but she's right. And a good editor doesn't take your book and make it their book. A good editor takes your book and makes it even more your book. They help you really bring your story out. So I trust her to be able to do that the same way I would trust a director to bring that out of me as an actor if I was in a play or a musical.
Another way to toughen yourself to criticism is to come to writing from teaching. That editorial letter always begins with a lie, too. It always begins with like, oh, it's a great manuscript. I hardly have any edits. And then there's like 1,500 words, and then you open up the document, and there's like 2,000 little edit notes in the document. So I don't think so. I have stories, I have manuscripts that I made like significant structural changes, and none of those have sold. So a lot of times it feels like if it's something that's that deep embedded in the story, then the story maybe is broken and I need to come up with a whole different approach. I do have my beta readers, my friends and critique partners who read my manuscripts before I go out on submission, and I have really good partners that took a very long time to find in many not successful critique groups before I found people who were really good at not trying to turn my story into their story. And I don't like the way you phrase this. This is how I would write it, or I don't like the choices you're making here, but instead who were trying to see what I was going for and trying to help me reach what I was going, write the story I was writing, and who are really good at telling me which parts of the book are awesome, so don't change this, or which parts are boring, or which parts don't make any sense, or which parts are unrealistic. And I feel like, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I feel like we had to train each other in how to give each other feedback and critiques.
I like the allusion to the theater you were saying before, because I kind of think the longer I'm writing, the more I like to think of the fact that I'm a storyteller, which is really an entertainer, right? So we're all entertaining. And why I'm making the changes is so the book is better for the reader. It's not really about me. So when I try to take it personally, that's the wrong way to go. It's putting my ego into the equation instead of making it about what's the best story can I tell. And so I have to trust my instincts, but I also have to understand that if somebody's giving me feedback and it's good feedback and it's going to make that story better for a reader, where that reader is more easily able to escape into my world, they're more entertained, then I need to do whatever that fix is, no matter how extensive it is, if it really works best to entertain the reader and for the story itself. So now, like, I really try not to get upset about feedback that way. I try to get excited about it, like we're trying to make the best possible book for you, so that when you pick it up, the world goes away and you just have a good time. That's the point.
Got a new question right here.
A couple of Florida questions. Does living in Florida impact your writing in any way?
Oh, yes. All my stories are based in Florida because that's what I know, and it really affects the setting. It affects, it shaped me, the culture of Florida, especially growing up in Miami. There's a strong cultural sense there, and that wove its way into who I am, my character as a person. So it always makes its way into my characters on the page and my settings and the society. Even the magic has to do with the culture that I grew up around. So it definitely played a role, yes.
All my books also take place in Florida, both real and imagined. Florida literature is like really important to me because I think Florida tends to take up a lot of space in pop culture, and other people have their perception of Florida. So it's important to me that we're also showing Florida, that it's not just Miami. We are, Central Florida is different, North Florida is different, and we have a lot of weird Florida lore and, Southern Gothic traditions, and I'd love to see that on the page explored more by Florida writers. So we are telling our own stories too, We're not just the punchline.
Yeah. I grew up in Miami also, and I'm Cuban American, and I've seen Miami in a lot of movies and television, and it's always been very entertaining, but it's never been my Miami. There's always, the Art Deco and everything's on South Beach, and okay, that's a real district that exists, but that's not where I grew up. And that's not a place where most people could afford to spend every single day anyway. And the other thing is, as a Cuban American, I'd see shows set in Miami, and there were like virtually no Cuban characters, unless they were the bad guy. And so both of my two books are set in Miami, and they're kind of set in my Miami. The first one is actually kind of in that old Cutler area, so you see a lot of like banyan trees and a lot of, not the beach, not the Miami that everybody is familiar with. And then the second book is largely set in Little Havana, and I wanted very much to play in that space, so it's very important to me.
For me, it's like this. It's like another character in my fiction. I grew up in Orlando. I moved to LA, lived there for 11 years, and then moved back. There's the famous novelist Thomas Wolfe said, "You can't go home again." I go home again almost in every book I try to in one way or another. And so even though my first book, half of the book is set in LA, all my other works are set in Orlando or in Florida because, it's so interwoven into who I am. Like the places that have come and gone. Like for example, I grew up, my high school was right across from Universal Studios and Dr. Phillips, right? So that became a character almost essentially in one of the books. And so I think the geography and the location of Florida, specifically Orlando, has inspired me in so many ways, and I don't think I could have been a writer had I not moved back to Orlando a few years ago.
I didn't grow up in Florida. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I spent a lot of time in Arkansas, a lot of years living there. So only one of my books is actually set in Florida. My third book, One Last Breath, is set in Florida, and it's set in the Florida Springs. It's a cold case mystery around the freshwater springs that we have here in Florida. And that was a place that I always loved, even before I moved to Florida. So I have books that are set in lots of places I've lived and loved. One is in Louisiana, one is on the Connecticut coast, that one is set here in Florida, up around Gainesville. And then my newest one that's coming out in March is set in the Ozarks, in the Arkansas Ozarks. So for me, I try to work those places that I love into those stories. And there's a part of, all of those places in those stories. And I've always loved Florida even before I moved down here. We spent a lot of time here. So I knew I wanted to tell a story in the Springs. For me, also practically, living in Florida impacts the way I write because I try to keep my deadlines at the end of the summer so that I can spend the summer inside writing when it's air conditioned, and I can have the rest of the year when it's really nice to go out and do stuff. So it affects it in sort of a practical way.
So for me personally, I did not live in Florida until 2 years ago. So my first book series most certainly does not take place in Florida. If you read my first book, you will be greeted with cold, a lot of cold. In fact, blizzard, snowy cold. No, I did not live in a blizzard, snowy, cold area either. That was the fun of playing with fantasy. But since moving here to Florida, I am finding so many cool things about the architecture and the food and the people and some of the plant life here and some of the animals here, and I'm just loving them more, and I find myself just inspired wanting to write more about where I live. And so yeah, I'm learning to write more landscapes that are more like Florida as I'm living here.
Honestly, I'm a lot like Ginny. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, so Florida is the place I came for college, and then I returned when I married someone from Florida. And so I'm not a native. I've lived here maybe 18 years, I think, at this point. So just this most recent book that I've done is based here in Florida. But for me, as a mystery writer, Florida's great because the Everglades is a perfect place to hide a body and not have somebody get caught, right? So there's some really cool things about Florida that way. And of course, the news stories are always outrageous. So for somebody who writes contemporary fiction, it's inspiring because there's always some kooky story where you're like, that's interesting. I could totally make a murder mystery out of that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any other place in the world that has as much wildlife, both animals and people, that Florida has. Just in our neighborhood, we had an alligator went right through my yard, right, from the golf course. Then we had a bear who was rummaging. So we had, and we have, all sorts of wildlife. And then if you just go on your Facebook neighborhood group, you're gonna have an endless supply of stories. So just the Florida neighborhood itself, you're never gonna have a better place to find inspiration.
Okay, so if you're in the audience, start thinking up if you have any questions. And I've got one final question for our group up here. What is the impact of social media on you as an author? The demands, the expectations, the fun, the connection, or you're sick of it?
Okay, so for me, social media has been a ton of fun. I am on only a few platforms. I try to make sure that I give myself some room to breathe because there are so many different social media platforms out there. But I have met some great and amazing writer friends over on Instagram that I am constantly chatting with. And we love to do middle grade book, since we're all middle grade writers, live streams on Halloween, and we all dress up as one of our characters, and we answer questions, and it is epic. So I absolutely love the connections that I can make over there, And the readers who join in on these types of events and ask me questions, they ask some of the cutest little questions. Like they ask me, "What's your favorite food?" And I'm just like, I have not thought of what this character's favorite food is ever. And they'll ask me things like, "What's your character's favorite Halloween candy?" And I'm just like, there is no Halloween in the regime, but okay. And so it's just wonderful to me, like meeting all these different readers and all these different writers over on social media. But as an author, it's important to leave your own personal space alone. So that way you can have some room to breathe between yourself and social media. But if you're able to do that, it can be fun.
Yeah, I think there's like two sides to it. So because writing can be really isolating. That's why events like this are fun, because sometimes I feel like I don't get to see my writer friends until we're doing something together. So when it's about community and finding each other, it's great, but it can also be a lot of pressure, because sometimes for our publishers, they really want our book to go viral on Book Talk or something, and we can't really do that organically. So it feels like a lot of the, at least in the YA space, it's a little different for middle grade, where it's a little more school focused. But for like YA and adult, there's a lot of pressure to market yourself online, be front facing, and sometimes we're little gremlins who just want to sit at our laptop. So it can be kind of tough.
It could turn into another full-time job for sure, trying to market your book.
It's incredibly simultaneously draining and fulfilling. Like you talked about the community aspect of it. I have met so many amazing members of the middle grade community and the writing community through X and through Instagram, but at the same time, I've spent my entire life working in social media. I worked in MySpace, I worked at the Orlando Magic running social, so it's so part of my normal world, but when it's about you and constantly trying to market your book or try to keep up, it can be draining. It really can take away from your own creativity. But at the same time, I do think there is an important part of it, and that is being able to engage with this group here, right? Like adding everyone on Instagram and just, sending a DM of oh, it was great to meet you. I mean, you create new friends, and I think that's the beauty of it. But there's also the part of it where you really don't want to kind of go in that part of town.
So my first writing career, writing science fiction and fantasy for adult readers, was largely driven, I think, any of the success I had was driven by social media, because I was very active on Twitter, and I found a very real community and a very organic community. There wasn't this buy my book. We were all just people who were struggling to sell our stories, and we would just talk about whatever we were passionate about. And then I've been fortunate enough to be a finalist for some big awards in science fiction and fantasy, and I think a lot of that was because, not necessarily, I wrote the stories, but discoverability, because there were people out there who had heard of me because of my social media presence, and so they would read my work, and you're more likely to nominate something that you've read, you're more likely to read something by somebody that you've heard of. So, invitations to anthologies and stuff like that were all driven by that. But then I became I was on the board of directors for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and sometimes when you're a little bit too well known, that puts a target on you, and I got messages that would say just horrifying things that I will not repeat, but it was a very dark side of social media, and just kind of, I can't be unguarded anymore, because when I was unpublished or barely published and it was just me and my friends, we could talk about whatever, but now there's always somebody looking to pop out and say a horrible thing to you. So that took a lot of the luster off of it, and I also just don't find that same energy is there for me anymore when I go online. So I don't really find that to be something that I'm very active in anymore.
Like most people, I think I have kind of a love-hate relationship with social media. I love being able to connect with readers, and I love being able, to get the word out about what I'm working on. I love being able to connect with writers. It's a lot of fun, but it takes a huge amount of time. And every, moment that I invest on making a video for TikTok or setting up something for Instagram, I mean, that's time that is taken away from writing. And it's very easy to let yourself slip into, where all of a sudden your work hours are, 70% 70% social media and 30% writing, and you're like, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm not a content creator, I'm a writer. And I think we have to kind of keep that in mind and find that balance. And it also, there's so much good about it and so much fun about it, but it also, once you get to a certain point, there's also a little bit of, how do I manage the line between my personal time and my personal space and my public sort of, facing as a writer, because people expect, if they message you, they expect a reply, and they expect a reply like right then, and they expect you to be absolutely able to reply to them. And sometimes you need to step back and take a break, and social media can make that really tricky.
Yeah, echoing everything you've said, my favorite part has been communicating with readers, with other writers. That's been the best part. But it is a huge distraction throughout the day. Like, I have to focus most of my time each morning to make a post, learn how to do nice photos to make them attractive. So it's like it's become another facet of this job that I wasn't prepared for. But it's something you go learning, and I don't like that publishers also have put that pressure on us writers to be the ones promoting ourselves through.
And unfortunately, once we learn one, it's kind of time to move on to the next one. Like, you're like, oh, just learn TikTok, please.
Yeah, I think you have to figure out what works best for you and do that. So I like social media, but I think I like personal interactions more. So for me, it's more authentic sometimes to do it in person. And what I know about social media is for book selling, not so awesome. For reader engagement, it's great. But for me to sell a book or try to sell a book, the best thing that can happen there is that somebody else who doesn't know me but read my book and liked it is the one talking about the book, not me. It's that authentic word of mouth thing, because authenticity is everything on social media, I think. And I think most kids are pretty adept at weeding out who's authentic and who's not. So me trying to create a persona for myself and a brand, I try to brand myself personally, and I use my social media to engage with readers. But I look at the book selling like my job in order to sell this book is to write the best possible book first. That's the most important piece, and I have to do that part. And that's my biggest vehicle to get my name out there. And then, hopefully readers start to read and like it and pass it on to somebody else. And that's what really helps writers. So if you read one of our books today and you love it, the best thing you can do is get on your social media and say, I love this book, I recommend it to you. If you would like to check out this middle grade book, read this, it's amazing. That's helpful. But I've gotten now where I back off the social media when I'm thinking I'm trying to sell, when I'm worried about my own numbers and how many of my books are selling. And I try to just think of it as I'm talking to readers, I'm giving them a little glimpse of who I am as a person. And hopefully when I do that, they think, oh, when I read her books, I kind of get a sense that she's the same person as she is online. Like, I get that flavor in her books, that voice is there.
I agree completely. I spent my debut year, 2024, trying to market, do all these things, to move the needle a little bit. I can only move so much on social media, but when I see like a kid in the front row holding my book and reading it, that means more to me than anything, because that's the reader that you're trying to reach, not some ambiguous handle on X.
Well, I will say now I'm feeling a little bit guilty for asking you guys to post a video to social media for AuthorFest. Okay, if we're going to end at 5, do we have any questions? We've got time for 1 or 2. Come on up. The mic is yours. And then we will do our contest drawing.
Ooh.
Oh.
Sorry.
That's all it goes? That works.
There you go.
When did you realize that writing is what you wanted to do? That you felt that you could hedge your bets on your ability, that you could hedge your bets on your storytelling, and go for it?
I'm going to answer that first because I think my answer is going to be different than a lot of these people. I never wanted to be a writer. I never planned to be a writer. That was not. I come from a family of writers. My mom was a middle grade writer. She has like 20 middle grade novels. So I was around writers, but that was never my thing. Theater was always my thing. I was a theater student. I majored in theater. I made my living in the theater. My brother became the poet laureate of the state that I lived in at the time, which was Oklahoma. So there was a partly sibling rivalry. So I was like, I've got to do something. But for me, it was just, it was something that I had always known I was good at, but it was never my passion. And then when COVID hit and all the theater that I was doing shut down, I thought, well, if I'm going to be stuck in my house all this time, I better sit down and try to write this novel I was thinking about. And so it really wasn't until I literally wrote that novel and got an agent and sold it at an auction that I thought maybe I could actually do this. I think most people that come into writing know that that's kind of their passion, but the point of this, I want you to know, is sometimes passions take you by surprise. Sometimes you don't know what you're good at when you're young or when you're starting out, and you may have many different surprises in your life about things you discover later on that you love and you're good at.
I love that. You're so cool.
Yeah,
We've had this question asked to us before,
yes,
right? And I remember because when I grew up, nobody in my family is a reader. So I was the only outlier that liked to read, that liked to write, and I never thought that that's something that you could actually do, even though I was reading other authors. I was like, they had to be born into this. Like, it's not something you could just do. But in my 20s, when I started reading a lot of young adult books and I was writing more, I was like, this is comparable. I could actually probably try to do this. And I started doing research, and then, and that became my career. But writing was always part of my life, for sure.
Yeah, going back into you never know about your passions. For me, I started writing short stories when I was 7. However, I was bullied horrendously in middle school for my writing. So I stopped and I said, well, I'm not doing that again. And then I dislocated my knee, and I had to quit theater, I had to quit dance, I had to quit almost all my extracurricular activities. And I was told, well, guess now you can focus on your academics and come home. That's all you'll do. That sounds great. And I said, you know what? I used to be a writer. Why can't I be a writer again? And so I then got into writing, and I actually did an entire project about the publishing process for high school and went into English after that because I just fell in love with writing again, and I couldn't imagine myself not working with books. So even when I'm not writing, I help edit for other stories because to me it's just important for people's stories to be heard and for people to feel like they can write their stories and feel validated to write them after having myself shut down when I was in middle school.
Okay, we've got time for 1 or 2 more answers, and then we have parents waiting to pick up some of these precious cargo.
Mine's quick. Sandra Cisneros, House on Mango Street.
I made my first attempt to write a novel when I was in 6th grade. I didn't finish it. And again in 8th grade, and I didn't finish it. In 9th grade, I didn't finish a book until I was in my 30s. But I gave up too easily. I would always, or when I did write short stories and I would send them out and I would get like 6 or 8 or 9 rejections, and I'd be like, okay, well, this isn't fun. And I would stop for 6 months or 8 months or a year. And I think it's because, like you were saying, I read books and I thought that writers were other people, and I didn't really think, I thought it was a lark that I was sending stories out, and it wasn't until like a friend of mine actually sold a story that I was like, wait, if this guy can sell a story, I can sell a story, you know.
I hate to admit this, but it's pretty poetic that I started writing in 6th grade to impress a girl, and I ended up, the girl ended up being named in one of my books, just as a, as a little nod, so.
All right, I'll be
Go
super
ahead.
fast.
That's fine.
So I'm exactly like you, actually. I had no idea I wanted to be a writer forever. I wasn't a writer. I mean, I read always, loved books. But when I was growing up, I had everyone else tell me, you should be a writer. And I'd be like, no, I don't want to do that. I was into a lot of other things. And so I did chorus, I did drama, I did all of that stuff. And I became a teacher. And then after I started teaching, I realized it's probably not good for an introvert who doesn't like to be around a lot of people to be teaching every day, because you're around a lot of people every day. And my favorite days were work days when no one was there. That's a bad sign. And so after I realized I didn't want to be a teacher, I thought, what would I do? I've always loved stories. I knew that. And it's like at that moment I realized, but like my mother, my teachers, everybody was like, well, duh, we've been telling you this forever. Why didn't you pick it up? And I didn't get it until I was in my 30s.
And now you have to be around a ton of people.
Okay, guys, we so appreciate all of that you have given us today in so many ways. So let's have a hand for our incredible authors in AuthorFest 2025. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to draw our raffles, and the first is for our Creature Comforts basket. That's the one with the tortilla blanket and the neck light and such. Remember, you've got to be here to win.
Tortilla
glasses.
blanket.
Yes, tortilla blanket. All right, and so the last three numbers are 022. Check and see if anybody's got it. 022.
I have like a big fluffy
Yeah?
but I'm just scrambling.
That's you? All right. Okay. Over to the library you go,
Use
and
the
the Creature
tortilla
Comforts
wisely.
basket is yours. All right. Next is the Kids at Heart with the slime and all of the candy. 115. Anybody have a 115? You do have to be present to win. All right. We'll try another. How about 024? 24. Yep. Okay. All right. Good for you, Kid at Heart. And take that to the library. And the last one is I can't keep my hands still. So the fidget spinners and all of that kind of stuff is going to go to number 88. Take a look. 88. We're looking hard. We think we've got a winner. Okay. All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful Friday and a fantastic weekend. And again, thank you to our 10th anniversary authors.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Tech, can we get the QR code up here?
Oh, actually, hold on. For students only, if you want a little extra credit for a QR code from a few teachers, our wonderful tech team is about to put that up. I certainly can.
Nobody saw me.